The morning I flew back into Atlanta, I didn't tell anyone I was coming. 11 years. That's how long I'd been gone. 11 years working as a registered nurse in Toronto, sending money home every month, trusting that my son was taking care of the property I'd left him, a 3-bedroom house on Sycamore Ridge Drive in Marietta, Georgia. Nothing flashy, but solid. I'd paid it off before I left. No mortgage, no liens, nothing. Just a clean deed with my son's name on it. Because I believed in him more than I believed in anything else in this world. His name is Theodore James Whitfield. He was 23 when I left, quiet and steady, the kind of young man who fixed things around the house without being asked. I thought leaving him the property would give him something to stand on, a foundation. What I came home to was not a foundation. It was rubble dressed up in fresh curtains. I took a cab from Hartsfield Jackson because I didn't want anyone knowing I'd landed. The driver didn't talk much, which suited me fine. I watched the Georgia pines through the window and felt something tighten in my chest, the way it does when you've been away so long that familiar things start looking strange. We turned onto Sycamore Ridge at 2:30 in the afternoon, and I asked the driver to slow down before we reached the house. There was a truck in the driveway, a big silver pickup I'd never seen before. The yard looked different. The flower beds I'd planted along the front walk were gone, replaced with plain mulch and a plastic lawn ornament shaped like a deer. My stomach turned before I even understood why. I paid the driver, took my suitcase to the sidewalk, and stood there. The curtains in the front window moved. I rang the doorbell. A woman answered. Late 30s, maybe 40, blonde highlights, a coffee mug in her hand, and an expression that told me she'd decided in less than 1 second that I was a stranger and therefore a problem. She looked me up and down the way people do when they've decided they already own everything in front of them. "Can I help you?" she said. "I'm looking for Theo," I said. "I'm his mother." Something shifted in her face. Not softness, more like recalculation. "He's at work," she said. "Who did you say you are?" "Sylvia Whitfield," I said. "This is my son's home, and mine, originally." She said her name was Renee. She said she was Theo's wife. I hadn't known Theo had gotten married. She let me inside, but she didn't offer me a seat. I set my suitcase near the door and looked around the living room. Almost nothing was the same. The furniture was different, heavier, darker. The framed photos on the wall were all of Renee and a man I assumed was her brother, and a few of an older woman I didn't recognize. Not a single photo of Theo. Not one of me. I asked her where Theo slept. She paused just long enough for me to notice, then gestured toward the back of the house. The bedroom she pointed me toward was not the master. It was the smallest bedroom, the one I'd used as a sewing room before I left. There was a cot in it, not a bed frame with a mattress, a cot, the kind you'd use for camping, pushed against the wall with a single pillow and a folded blanket, a duffel bag on the floor, a phone charger plugged into the wall. That was all. I stood in that doorway for a long moment, and I didn't say anything. I didn't trust myself to. When Theo came home that evening, I was sitting on the front porch steps. He stopped at the end of the driveway and looked at me like I was something he'd imagined so many times that he'd stopped believing I was real. He was 34 years old and he looked 50, thin, eyes that had learned not to expect much. He said, "Mum." Just that. I stood up and opened my arms, and he walked into them the way he used to when he was small, and he didn't let go for a long time. We sat on the porch steps together until it was dark, and he told me things I hadn't known. He told me quietly, the way people tell things they've rehearsed alone for years. Renee had moved in 2 years after I left, when Theo was 25 and lonely and willing to believe that someone choosing him meant something good. Her brother, a man named Craig, came with her. Just temporarily, Renee had said. Just until he got back on his feet. Craig was still there 9 years later, occupying the master bedroom. Renee slept there too. I said, "And you sleep in the sewing room?" Theo looked at the ground. She said it was easier, because I work early shifts and she doesn't want to be woken up. I asked him about the finances. He told me slowly, piece by piece, like he was pulling something sharp out of his own hand. He worked as a maintenance technician at a commercial property company, good steady work, decent pay. His paychecks went into a joint account he and Renee had opened together. She managed the bills, she said. She was better with money, she said. Every time Theo asked about the account balance, she had an explanation. The truck payment, the insurance, the credit card they'd needed for the kitchen renovation. There was always a reason there was nothing left. The house, I discovered, was no longer in Theo's name. I found this out on the third day, after I'd been sleeping on the couch because there was nowhere else for me to sleep in the house that was legally supposed to belong to my son. I called the Cobb County Property Records Office from the backyard, quietly, with my hand cupped around my phone. The woman on the other end confirmed what I had started to suspect. The deed had been transferred 4 years ago. The property was now in the name of Renee and Craig Holloway, joint tenants with right of survivorship. I asked how that was possible without Theo's knowledge. The woman said all she could tell me was what the records showed. The transfer had been notarized. Theo's signature was on the document. I went back inside. Renee was in the kitchen. Craig was on the couch watching television with his feet on the coffee table. I walked through the living room without looking at him and found Theo in the garage, reorganizing his tools the way he did when something was bothering him, the way he'd done since he was a teenager. I showed him the property records on my phone. He read the screen. He read it again. He said, "That's not right." "When did you sign anything about the house?" I asked. He thought for a long time. Then he said, "There was a thing Renee asked me to sign. 2, maybe 3 years after she moved in. She said it was something about homestead exemption for the property taxes." He paused. I didn't read it all the way through. She was standing there and she said it was just a formality. He signed it at the kitchen table. She had a notary come to the house. He thought it was about a tax discount. It was the deed transfer. I didn't say anything to Renee that night. I didn't say anything to Craig. I called my daughter-in-law's mother, just to check one more thing, and she was perfectly pleasant on the phone, told me she was so glad I was visiting, that Theo was lucky to have such a devoted mother. She didn't know anything, or she knew everything, and was very practiced at pleasantry. I couldn't tell which yet. The next morning I drove to a branch of the bank where Theo had his joint account. He came with me. We sat with a personal banker who pulled up the account history and walked us through it, line by line. Theo had been depositing approximately $3,400 a month for the past several years. The account was drained almost to zero every month. The expenses included 2 car payments, Theo's and Renee's truck, utilities, groceries, and a recurring transfer of $800 a month to an account in Craig's name labeled Household Contribution. Craig had been receiving $800 a month from Theo's paycheck for years. Craig, who paid no rent, who slept in the master bedroom of a house Theo had once owned, was being paid by Theo every month. I thanked the banker. I asked for printed statements going back 5 years. She printed them. We drove home in silence. After a while, Theo said, "I kept thinking I was the problem, like I wasn't managing things right." I said, "You weren't the problem." He looked out the window. "I felt crazy," he said, "like I couldn't trust my own memory. That's what gaslighting does to a person. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly, the way water gets into the foundation of a house. You don't see the damage until the wall starts to bow." That afternoon I made a call I should have made days earlier. I called Lawrence O'Caffell, an attorney in Atlanta I'd been referred to through a colleague back in Toronto. He handled property disputes and family law. I'd found his name before I even boarded the plane, because the last 2 months before I came home, I'd been getting Theo's texts at strange hours, short, careful messages that said nothing specific but felt like everything was wrong. A mother knows. I called Lawrence and told him what I had. The deed transfer obtained under false pretenses, the documented financial control, the bank statements. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "How soon can you come in?" I met with Lawrence the following morning. I brought the bank statements, the property records printouts, and a written timeline I'd spent the previous evening putting together at the kitchen table, while Renee watched television in the next room and didn't know what I was doing. Lawrence reviewed everything carefully and then looked up at me and said, "This is fraud, Mrs. Whitfield. What was done with that deed is deed fraud, and what's been done with his finances looks like financial exploitation of a domestic partner." He said Georgia statutes covered this. He said Theo had a strong case. He said, "I want to be honest with you, these cases can take time, but the evidence you brought me is solid." I asked him what we needed to do first. He said the first step was to get Theo out of that house safely, and the second step was to file a quiet title action to challenge the deed transfer. I want to tell you that I handled the next part gracefully. I didn't entirely. I went home and I looked at Renee sitting in the living room, and I felt something white-hot move through me that I had to walk back outside to let pass. I stood on the back porch with my hands on the railing, and I breathed until I could think clearly again. I was not going to give her the satisfaction of a scene. I had not driven myself and my son to this moment to throw it away on anger. That night I sat down with Theo at the kitchen table after Renee and Craig had gone to bed, and I laid out everything Lawrence had told me. Theo listened with his hands flat on the table and his face very still. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. He said, "I was embarrassed. That's why I didn't call you more. I kept thinking I'd fix it." I said, "There was nothing for you to fix. They did this to you." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "Okay, what do we do?" We filed the quiet title action the following week. Lawrence simultaneously filed a petition for an emergency protective order for Theo based on the documented financial abuse. The day the paperwork was served, Renee called me from inside the house while I was standing in the driveway. She came to the front door and she said with absolute composure, "You don't understand the full situation." I said, "I have the deed transfer, the notarized document Theo signed under false pretenses, 5 years of bank statements, and an attorney. What part of the situation am I missing?" She didn't answer that. Craig, to his credit, left within 48 hours. He took the silver pickup and 3 carloads of belongings and was gone before the week was out. Renee stayed longer, but the protective order restricted her financial access and Lawrence moved quickly. The deed fraud case was referred to the Cobb County District Attorney's Office, which opened a criminal investigation. 7 months later, Renee Holloway pleaded guilty to 1 count of deed fraud and 1 count of financial exploitation. She was sentenced to 3 years probation and ordered to pay full restitution, all $800 monthly transfers to Craig, plus a lump sum determined by the court to account for the financial control during the marriage. Craig was charged separately and received a plea agreement that included community service and his own restitution order. The deed was restored to Theo's name. I was in that courtroom when the judge signed the final order. Theo sat next to me, and I watched his face when the judge read the ruling, and something in it loosened. Something he'd been holding so tightly for so long that I don't think he even knew it was there until it was gone. After the hearing, we went to lunch at a diner on Roswell Road that Theo had been going to since he was a teenager. He ordered the patty melt. I ordered coffee and pie. We sat in a window booth with the Georgia sun coming through, and he talked more in that 2 hours than he had in 11 years combined. He talked about what he wanted to do with the house now. He'd been thinking about converting the garage into a proper workshop. He wanted to start a small appliance repair business on the side, evenings and weekends. He had a plan. He'd had it for a while, he said, but there'd never been any money to start it with. He has the money now. I went back to Toronto to finish out my last several months of work before my retirement. I called him every Sunday, which I should have been doing all along, and I will tell you plainly, that is my part in this. Not a small part. I left my son alone with a property and a trust in him, and very little framework for what to do, when someone came along and systematically dismantled that trust. I sent money, and I called when I could, and I told myself that was enough. It wasn't enough. I knew it wasn't enough even then, and I chose the easier thing. I am not asking for absolution on that point. I'm just saying it plainly because Theo deserved better from me, and he knows it, and I know it, and we've talked about it since, the way you can talk about hard things once the emergency is over. I retired in March. I'm back in Marietta now, in a rental apartment 10 minutes from Sycamore Ridge Drive. I have dinner with Theo on Thursdays. He got the garage workshop set up in October, and he's already got more repair jobs than he can handle some weeks. He looks different now. Not young exactly, but lighter, like himself. The deer lawn ornament is gone. He put the flower beds back in the spring. Impatiens, the same as I used to plant, pink and white all along the front walk. The first time I pulled into his driveway and saw them, I had to sit in the car for a minute before I went inside. Some things you plant before you leave. Some things wait for you to come back before they bloom. I've thought a lot about what made all of this possible. Not just what Renee and Craig did, but what allowed it to go on as long as it did. And the honest answer is that it wasn't only their dishonesty. It was also Theo's patience, which had been trained into something closer to silence. It was my distance, which I had dressed up as trust. It was the way we had all, in our different ways, chosen the easier thing over the necessary one. People who exploit others the way Renee and Craig exploited my son don't usually announce themselves. They move slowly. They make themselves useful first. They establish a rhythm of dependency, and then gradually, quietly, reverse who is depending on whom. By the time the person being taken from starts to feel something is wrong, they've already been made to feel that their instincts can't be trusted. There's not an accident, that's a method, and it works precisely because decent people tend to give the benefit of the doubt, and because shame, the shame of admitted date, keeps people quiet long after they should have spoken. Theo stayed quiet for years because he believed, somewhere underneath everything, that if he just worked harder or asked fewer questions or gave more time, things would balance out. That's not weakness, that's what happens to a person when their reality has been slowly rewritten for them. The intelligence was always there. The capacity to see clearly was always there. What had been systematically removed was his confidence that what he was seeing was real. What I know now, that I wish I'd understood earlier, is that intelligence without information is just potential sitting in the dark. I thought leaving Theo a paid-off property and a monthly transfer was giving him a foundation. It was, in material terms, but I left him without the one thing that might have protected him, a regular, honest accounting between us. Not because I didn't care, but because I assumed caring was enough. It isn't. Care without attention is just a feeling. What protects people is presence, and when you can't be physically present, the next best thing is consistent, genuine contact. A real conversation, not a monthly check. The courage it took Theo to sit on those porch steps and tell me the truth, after years of protecting me from it, after years of protecting his own pride. That was not a small thing. And the courage it took to walk into that bank, to sit with that attorney, to let a stranger review the paperwork of his own humiliation. That was not a small thing either. Resilience doesn't look the way people think it looks. It doesn't look like someone who was never knocked down. It looks like someone who was knocked down for a long time, and who got up anyway when someone finally held out a hand. What Renee and Craig did had a cost. Not a poetic, abstract cost. A specific, legal, financial cost that a court calculated and ordered repaid. Actions that harm people tend to carry forward. Maybe not immediately, maybe not in the way you'd expect, but the accounting does come one way or another, in courtrooms or in consequences, or simply in the quality of the life you end up building on what you took from someone else. Theo is building something real now, slowly, on his own terms, with his own hands. That workshop in the garage on Sycamore Ridge Drive is not a large thing in the world, but it is entirely his, and that, I've come to understand, late but not too late, is everything.